Superheroes Academy. Unleash your agile superpowers. Welcome to the Superheroes Academy session on scaling. I'm your coach, Brock Argue. I'm joined by our other Superheroes Academy coach, Erkan Kadir.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about scaling, why we might want to do it, why we might not, different scaling frameworks, and just how this applies in your organization and for you as a Scrum Master. Many organizations struggle to stay lean and adapt quickly as they grow their agile implementations past a few teams and outward from the development team through to the rest of the organization to really develop that agile organization. This makes scaling agile and Scrum in particular a hotly debated topic. One of the reasons for the debate is that the Scrum framework doesn't address the issue of scaling directly. Of course, depending who you talk to, many people believe Scrum scales just fine on its own, but it's not specifically called out in how that should work. Many Agilists believe the fundamentals of Scrum applied to all teams and at all levels of the organization is all that is needed to scale indefinitely. Other Agilists feel that supplemental frameworks on top of Scrum can accelerate the scaling organization. So first interesting point that I wanted to talk about today, Erkan, was just the idea of not scaling. And it's such a big thing where everyone wants to how do we scale? When I'm working with organizations, one of the first things they ask is, how do we scale? What framework should we use? Whatever it is.
Yeah.
So what are some thoughts there as to why maybe it's not such a good idea to scale?
Well, if we're focusing on why not to scale, if an organization is newly introduced to Agile and the first thing that they're thinking of is scaling, a lot of the times it's kind of a way out of doing all of the things within Agile that you're supposed to be doing. And so some critics might say that some of the scaling frameworks are too cautious way of implementing Agile.
Yeah. One of the other things that I often raise up when people ask me well, why do you hesitate on some of these scaling frameworks? Is I notice a lot of them, there's a significant cost to implementing it, whether that's in terms of additional roles to handle the coordination that Scrum says teams should just do, or whether it's a specific training or methodology or consultants that you have to come in to help you with that particular scaling framework. So to me, that's one of my big hesitations is that really necessary for the organization at this time?
Yeah, that's a good one. Another one that comes to mind is just, it's really important to make sure that you're doing Agile well within a single team or a single part of the organization before you scale that out. Because it's important to realize that whatever we duplicate is going to filter out into the rest of the organization. So if we're doing something bad on one team and then we go ahead and scale, we're just going to repeat those. We're going to repeat those failures throughout.
Well, that's I hadn't really thought of that. That's an interesting one. Just kind of repeating the unhelpful patterns, I guess. Yeah. I also find that we apply or just drop scaling frameworks on organizations lots of times without considering things like cultural fit and what makes sense for the organization. And one of the conversations I'm in right now with a client is really talking through what problems do we have and do we think we can solve with scaling, and focusing on let's just solve those problems. And maybe by solving those problems, we're going to take from a specific scaling framework to help with that. But at the end of the day, we're not going to apply an entire framework, but we're going to add bits and pieces to kind of organically build a scaling framework essentially that works for us and fits our culture. And so that's been my approach so far. I don't know if you've had a different approach or a similar experience.
I've had similar experiences where when you dig into the reasons of why it is that you want to scale, you can often solve those problems without scaling at all and just focusing on the core of Agile and what parts can we do a better job with.
Nice. Yep.
Another thing I'll add that you tend to hear a lot is just that the scaling frameworks themselves tend to violate the first principle of the Agile Manifesto, specifically individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So we talked about this a little bit with the one size fits all. We've also heard terms like fast food for agile, and that type of thing. Because every context is so different from another, and it's easy to become enamored by the elegance of a framework when it's presented to you in somebody else's organization, but whether it's going to work within your context or with the people and the processes that you have is difficult to say.
Yeah, good point. Interesting. So what scenarios, or like when is it a good idea to apply a scaling framework, or to focus on scaling your organization?
I can't remember who said the quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same applies with scaling frameworks. There's great ideas in all of them. And through the study of those frameworks, we're able to think about the problems of our contexts in new and different ways. And sometimes they spark ideas that we hadn't thought of before.
Okay. Yeah. And one of the things I find helpful is the patterns that we see in some of the frameworks. And so when I talk about, like, I apply pieces of a scaling framework to an organization, I find that there's patterns that are present in the frameworks that are helpful. And so kind of like what you're saying with all models are useful, I would even say, like, all patterns are, and just kind of seeing like what patterns from those frameworks are helpful. Some of the frameworks focus more on, enterprise alignment, whereas other ones focus more on teams. And so by pulling some of these patterns, or tools or techniques that they advocate for, such as systems thinking, we're able to, really find a way that helps move things forward for organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another one is, you had mentioned this at the start of the video, but Scrum doesn't actually mention anything over the team level. And so there's just not a lot of guidance there. And so many proponents of scaling feel that some type of guidance or some type of framework is necessary, which is why you see a lot of organizations adopting them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, so I'm just thinking, as far as like when to scale, obviously scaling is about size, but when does size play a factor here? Like is applying a scaling framework absolutely necessary at certain sizes, or can Scrum scale kind of indefinitely?
Yeah, good question. I have seen organizations be successful using Scrum and only Scrum throughout the different levels of the organization. So you might have Scrum teams that are supported by leadership teams that use Scrum, which are supported by executive teams that use Scrum. And then you might have Scrum that is a small part of an organization that's just kind of burgeoning and kind of getting its roots in a well-established organization. And they have the need to interface with maybe different parts of the organization that are at different parts of their agile journeys. And so the frameworks can help facilitate some of that interfacing between the non-agile or less agile parts of the organizations and the new ones. So I guess that really depends on the context to answer that question accurately.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Sorry, just a question that came off the top of my head there. Also thinking in terms of when scaling is useful, these days it seems like it's an easier thing to sell to executives in terms of, not from my standpoint, but from organizations. It makes sense to them to have these processes and things. So it's familiar, right? The challenge there is it's not always beneficial. So that's where we have that struggle and that balance, is to just because the organization or the executives think it's a good idea, like, yeah, it sounds like what we used to do, so let's just do the same thing. How do we balance that out so that it's the right approach and the right things, as opposed to just like, well, that's what they asked for.
Yeah. And I agree, I completely agree with a lot of the purists who say that you don't need it if you do Scrum well at many levels. But at the same time, if you are not really explicit and intentional about that, it can create a void where another framework might end up coming in that's less agile.
Yeah.
And so just being explicit that, hey, agility across the organization is something that we want to achieve, and getting that kind of shared understanding can also be a really valuable thing.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, because we often miss that, the shared understanding. I've had this conversation, I think, 3 times in the last few days, where really having that shared understanding of the goals of, what we're trying to do in terms of our agile process, agile mindset, in terms of the product and the vision of what we're trying to deliver, that kind of thing. Super important. And so any initiative, scaling or product or otherwise, needs to start there with that shared understanding.
Yeah.
Nice.
And just one last argument, both against and for.
Okay.
You hear some people maybe feel that some scaling frameworks can only take you so far with respect to agility. However, the flip side of that coin is it's also a great way for some organizations to get started. So it'll allow you to maybe meet an organization where they're at in their journey and help them take at least a few steps. And so that kind of shoe level guidance for an organization can really help kind of kickstart the agile transformation.
Yeah. And, that's it's an interesting point as a coach, where lots of times I hear other coaches talk about, like, well, I won't even get involved with that organization because they can't get all the way. And lots of times, and in how I've approached my coaching is I'm there to help them be better. And so if I can help them be a little bit better than they used to be, there's still value there. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Couldn't agree more.
The framework would help to get them a little bit better. Maybe not the whole ideal picture we want, but that's a start, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Good. So what are the most popular frameworks these days? Like, what are some things we're seeing?
Well, let's take a look. So this is a graphic that I pulled from the latest State of Scrum survey done by the Scrum Alliance.
Okay.
And they surveyed, I can't remember how many people, but these are the most popular frameworks that are being used by the respondents of this survey. And you can see the top here, the most popular is no specific framework. And I'm assuming that this doesn't mean that they're not using pieces, or at least some people are using pieces of different frameworks. They just haven't gone far enough with anyone that they want to say that, this is the one that's influencing our organization.
Okay. Or possibly they're small enough that they haven't needed to consider it yet.
Perhaps. Yeah.
I don't know.
That makes sense. And then you've got Scrum of Scrum and SAFe, which are both pretty much tied at first or second place, depending on how you want to look at it. Then the next kind of level here is SAFe Less and Scrum at Scale. And then rounding out the last couple options here are Disciplined Agile Delivery, or DAD, and Nexus. So why don't we take a closer look at each one of these? We can chat about Scrum of Scrum first. And so this is really a technique to scale Scrum up to large groups. So, anything over a 2-pizza team. And the way you do it is you split your group into agile teams of, let's say, like 5 to 10 people. And they all scrum. But then you coordinate work by having each team designate an ambassador. And then those ambassadors attend a meeting every so often called the Scrum of Scrums. So the Scrum of Scrums it's very similar, or the meeting, it's very similar to a traditional Scrum in that you have 3 questions. But there are some important differences. So for instance, the 3 questions you answer are not just, what did our team do in the last, day or week or what have you, but what did our team do that impacts other teams? And what are we planning to do that impacts other teams? And, what are the roadblocks of our teams, or what are we impacted on? Okay. And so it's very much daily stand-up like, but with a couple key differences. So I already mentioned that the questions are different, but It can also be longer, so it doesn't have to be 15 minutes. And the reason for that is this is actually a problem-solving meeting. So when impediments come up or dependencies between the groups come up, people are actually encouraged right there to kind of work together and solve the problems. And the other thing is that the Scrum of Scrums meeting doesn't actually have to be daily. So you can do it weekly or every couple of days, or whatever works for the specific set of teams that you're syncing.
Okay, yeah. Now that being said, and we'll see this as we get into some of the frameworks, some would argue that not having it daily is just that much longer to get impediments resolved for the teams. Mm-hmm. So that's something to consider as well. But yes, that's true. The other thing I was curious about with Scrum of Scrums was, you mentioned an ambassador going from the teams. Is that the same person? Is it the Scrum Master? Does it change? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of guidance on exactly how that should work, but I've seen teams be successful with it in all of the different configurations that you just mentioned, and even it being a rotating role, whatnot. You might have several Scrum of Scrums, one for the Scrum Masters, one for the product owners, for instance, so that you're syncing up and removing dependencies on multiple levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's in the LESS framework, because they have a similar concept as far as, I think they call it visitors, where someone would go to another team Scrum to hear what's going on, and they suggest don't send the same person and don't send the Scrum Master. It should be a team member.
Okay.
Because they're better able to comment on the work, and it kind of spreads that responsibility. So it's not like, well, the Scrum Master has to do all of that type of coordination or work, right?
Yeah, I like that.
So that's an interesting thought as well. Cool. Okay. So the other one then that we got next there is SAFe. So we'll take a quick look at that as well. Okay, so SAFe is one of those frameworks that has a lot in it, and a lot that it prescribes in terms of how you should go about implementing the framework. One of the things I like about SAFe is it really does try to focus on generating that alignment all the way down the organization as towards the goals, the vision, how we're spending our money, that type of thing. One thing I don't like about it is it's one of the ones that I feel is expensive and adds roles that, to do coordination that don't necessarily need to be there. And so there's extra roles, there's extra cost, and that type of thing for organizations. Obviously we got the enterprise and some strategic themes that we want to focus on. And then there's kind of, owners and people working at the enterprise level, such as the architects and the portfolio managers, to kind of really oversee and manage like what happens with those. They advocate for a portfolio Kanban board with all of the items that we're working on kind of at the enterprise level. And then this is one of the things I like is the lean budgets, really just deciding what percentage of our budget we're spending in all of these different portfolio areas. And those then roll out into value streams that, people are in charge of, and really focusing on coordinating those value streams and delivery of value within those streams, I guess, all the way down the organization. Associated with those are KPIs, ways to measure how we're doing and how successful we are achieving the goals of the value stream. And so again, those are good things to be doing, and knowing where do we want to spend our money, why, how well are we doing at that, and that kind of thing. So that's, I think, fairly helpful. Then we get down a bit into the program level. So that was portfolio level. Then we get down in the program level. And this is where we see, again, we're still a bit above the teams. We're like a level above the teams here. We have some coordinations in terms of a system architect, a release train engineer, and overall product management, kind of guiding what we're doing. And there's business owners who would be in charge of their specific value stream and really focusing on getting the value delivery that we want there. SAFe does this as far as releasing value and completing increments of value in the form of the agile release train, which is basically for that value stream where we have code and product that we're building and checking in And that's all being done in a big chunk by all of the teams on that release train. And then when that's supposed to go out, we cut it, it ends, and then we ship what we have. If you miss the train, as it were, for that timing, you wait till the next one. And so you can kind of see they have, continuous exploration, integration, deployment, all kind of advocated for there.
Yeah. And each one of those trains is 5 sprints long by default. And then it ends with a HEAP sprint, which stands for hardening, innovation, and planning. So every 6 months or every 6 sprints is how often you can expect a train to come by.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for adding that. That's good. So what other things happen in that 6th sprint then? Because it sounds like that's not a development sprint necessarily.
No, it's just about integration. So integration, quality, making sure that you're kind of ready to release.
Okay. My understanding is that during that time, they're also focused, like the teams are also focused on doing planning for the next set of sprints as well as innovation time. So where like Google would build in your 20% time or whatever, in SAFe, they're saying like in that last sprint, the teams can plan for the next set of sprints and do any innovation work that they want.
Yes,
okay.
Also true. Okay. Another interesting concept from the program is that each program has a single product backlog and single technology-focused architecture runway, which contains features and feeds the team's backlogs.
Okay, very good. Okay, and then we get down to the team level, and I believe this is going to look very much like it does for any kind of Scrum or Kanban organization, other than the fact of having the 5 sprints and then delivery. Yeah. Okay. So whereas a standard Scrum teams might be releasing every sprint or every couple sprints or whatever it might be. But the dev team looks similar with a Scrum Master, product owner, and developers using Kanban or Scrum, and then really working with their sprint planning and execution to build up their own team backlog that they're working on, and then kind of pushing it through the system. As we talked about just a second ago in regards to the release train and the set of sprints that we're working on and that kind of thing. Another interesting thing about SAFe is there's some additional kind of legends and maps that you see down at the bottom and on the side. The idea that they have with these, I think they call it a pellet actually. And the idea here is that these are all useful things that you can drop in wherever it makes sense for your organization, but they're not necessarily advocated for as like that's part of the framework, you have to have it. But things like communities of practice, those are valuable, or metrics. We find that those are valuable in different ways. And as you're implementing SAFe, you can figure out like, where do I need a community of practice? Should I drop that into the framework here, or do any of those types of things? So that's kind of what these additional pieces are about. We're looking at portfolio SAFe. There are other versions of SAFe, depending on size and scale, essentially. And I think SAFe kind of does divide it up by the size of the organization. I like to look at the portfolio SAFe most because it seems to resonate well with a product team, working on a product at scale. And so that's kind of why I like to look at this one. SAFe also versions their framework. So this could be another thing that we might look at as a downside of a scaling framework where, see version 4.5 here, SAFe, as they, learn and find new ways to do things, older versions are deprecated and you actually have to move on to the next version of SAFe, and they kind of tell you how to do that. And this is where consultants and other people get involved to help you move forward with that next implementation. So in some ways it feels like you're constantly trying to keep up with the releases of the framework as opposed to learning and innovating yourself on what works best in your organization. Mm-hmm. So just another thought there. So that's SAFe. Next one we're going to move on to is LESS, which is large scale Scrum. And so we'll flip over to that one. There we are. Now this is a framework that that was created by Bas Fode and Craig Larman. And they've implemented this many times in large organizations with great success over the past 30 years or so. And so there's a lot of different components here. What we'll do, we'll go over just the basic framework that you see in the middle here first, and then we can kind of talk a bit about some of the other things that you see, these other circles that are kind of surrounding the main framework there. So one of the main things that Les focuses on, one of the principles, is that of a whole product focus. And so by doing that, what Les, or the way Les does that, I guess, is implements one product owner and one product backlog per product. Okay. And so, there's not team backlogs or anything like that. There's one product backlog. And so you see that we start up here we have our product owner and our backlog. Les really is Scrum scaled. And so it's just Scrum, but they've found ways that work in terms of enabling the teams to coordinate their work and enabling the teams to maintain that whole product focus along with their product owner and that type of thing.
Yeah, one of the ways they one of the ways they scale in the product owner role is they actually transferred responsibility to the teams to clarify requirements and refine the backlogs directly with customers. And so the product owner role then becomes more about facilitating the creation of relationships between the Scrum teams directly with the clients, so that they can focus on vision and refining the product backlog and that type of thing.
Yeah, nice. Okay. Yeah, so the roles change a bit then, right? And we see that, so the product owner, that's a good one. We see that with the teams too, where they have a bit more responsibility than, I'm going to say then they might in a normal Scrum implementation. I don't know if that's actually true, because in Scrum, the team's empowered to do a lot of the work and coordination, but really called out specifically here as well.
Mm-hmm. And again, the product owner is still responsible for it. They just kind of delegate the responsibility to the team. And
yeah, thank you. I appreciate that distinction. That's good. So then looking at how this all works is we have our sprint planning part 1. And if you recall from your CSM training, sprint planning part 1 is the what of the sprint. So that's really talking about the sprint goal, the product backlog items that the product owner wants the team to focus on, and the team's forecasting out how much of that they can do. Then we fall into sprint planning part 2, which is where each team breaks out individually themselves to talk about how they're going to implement the specific backlog items that they've chosen to work on. And Les advocates for, if there's multiple teams on a product, that they would do this planning kind of together in the same room, but they're in their individual teams, so that as dependencies are identified or other things that they need to coordinate, or maybe trade off, once they get into something, they realize actually this other team should do this work, they're better suited or whatever it is. The teams are right there and they can just talk back and forth and kind of do that coordination right there, with the goal that when we all leave the meeting, everyone knows what they're doing and we can just start building. Then the teams get into their sprint. There is Scrum Master on the teams, but then you also see this coordination lines here, and really what that's talking about is the teams just coordinate and they just figure that out. Unlike a framework like SAFe, there is not a specific role who's responsible for coordinating. We're not hiring any additional people to do that. The teams, they know the work, they're closest to the work. They just go and figure it out and coordinate with each other. So that's one of those ones where, I might see that as an added responsibility that they might have.
And one of those coordination responsibilities, they actually have something very similar to a Scrum of Scrums in LESS, where each team will have an ambassador, and then daily they'll get together and remove impediments and discuss dependencies and that kind of thing.
Nice. Yeah, across the product?
Correct.
Yeah, cool. I like that. And then partway through, there's product backlog refinement. So again, the Scrum Guide talks about this as an activity that has to happen, about 10% of the team's time, unless the way they express this is there's a product backlog refinement in two ways. There's kind of an overall refinement, and then there's team-specific refinement. And so this here is kind of representing either of those. And the teams are really the ones that need to decide like what type makes the most sense. On a larger product with many teams, you might have an overall refinement where representatives from the teams get together. And then the team-specific one might have more of the individual teams just working together as a complete team. And same as Scrum, there's a daily stand-up, daily Scrum every day for each team, as well as that coordination stand-up as well. We hit the end of the sprint. In this order, we do an overall sprint review. And so this is for all of the teams on the product, including your stakeholders and clients and whoever else would need to be there. This is where we talk about how the sprint went, what was accomplished, and we demonstrate the working software that was built, or product of any kind, I guess. Then we do team retrospectives. So each team in that product area would do a retrospective and discuss how they're going to improve and how they're going to get better for the next sprint. And then there's an overall retrospective, again, where representatives from each team get together and talk about, maybe what they saw during the sprint, really focused on improvements in areas of coordination for the team, challenges they saw across teams, and then how they're delivering their product. So kind of more of that higher level product focus, across all the teams in the overall retrospective.
Nice. Yeah. I can't remember if we mentioned this, but you'd have between 3 and 8 teams, I believe, within each one of these kind of systems, so all supported by a single product owner. And then if you wanted to kind of scale out, in addition to that, then there's this concept of less huge, where each area has its own product owner that all kind of filters up into a single product owner that manages the backlog for the whole system.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We'll look at less huge in just a second here as well, because that is kind of shows the larger scale, but definitely 3 to 8 teams for the less framework that we're looking at here. And then the last thing, of course, we end up with a potentially shippable product increment at the end. And then we just do all of that again. Okay. And so you can see very much the less framework is just Scrum, but we found ways to kind of scale it and enable the communication and whatnot through a lot of the different kind of additional principles and things that you see surrounding the picture here. So let's jump down and look at less huge, and then we can talk about a few of those other things briefly as well. So this is a picture of what less huge looks like. What you can see is the sprints look the same as what we just looked at in less, but what's changed is the size of the whole thing, I guess, because it's much larger, but the product owner structure is a little different. Okay. So as Erkan was mentioning, we have an overall product owner, and there's still one product backlog. But then within that product owner has area product owners who help out in coordinating a set of teams. And so perhaps, if the whole product is rather large, perhaps these area product owners would be around things like the mobile product, or, maybe different parts of the experience that we have. And each area product owner would have 3 to 8 teams still.
Nice. Just a couple thoughts on transitioning into less, an organization into less. Less is really big on the concept of descaling an organization. So you might have an organization that was successful with a certain number of agile teams, and then they exploded really quickly, and maybe the productivity ended up reducing. so much so that they were actually producing less than the initial few that started the agile implementation. And so what Les says is, hey, you know what? Let's descale. Let's roll this whole agile implementation back just to a couple teams where we know we can be successful, where we know we can be productive and add value. And then let's do less with those teams, and let's only add once we're successful and once we're doing it well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
The other thought just on transformation is that what's not shown in these diagrams is almost as important as what is, because transformations is really about stripping away any process that's within an organization that is not in here and could potentially inhibit agility. So any process rule, hierarchy, or anything like that you don't see in the diagram is said to take away from the empowerment of these teams that are within this less structure. And so by taking those away and focusing on what you see here is how kind of you get to the tagline of less, where you achieve more with less.
Nice. Good tie in there. I like that. Okay, so that's less huge, which is the same thing just for larger organizations. And website here is less.works. You can take the time to investigate the site, all of these, additional principles and things that are important for less. You can click on them and find more information. And there are books out on less. A lot of the content in the book is actually on this website, and you can read some of the chapters here. So please do come to less.works and, review and study for yourself what there is to share here. There's also a video that we'll share along with this one that the creators of less have put out that talks about the basics of less and introducing it into your organization and why that may or may not be the right choice for you. And so that's a really interesting one that we'll share also. But you can see here just some of the different principles that there are. Looking at systems thinking and lean thinking is part of it. Here's the specific principles that less has. So again, you can see here's the whole product focus that we talked about, more with less. Erkan mentioned systems thinking, queuing theory, empirical process control. So these are all things you can kind of dig into and look at what is less based on and why are these things important and what does it mean for me and my organization. So please do take some time to investigate the site as well. Okay.
Which one's next?
I was gonna say, is there anything else here we needed to look at?
You know what, actually, I would actually add one more thought just on when less would be better than other times. Occasionally you have a large product that requires multiple teams to be working on in unison. And I think less would work really well in that particular context. However, some of the newer or more advanced techniques that you see in agile organizations, like continuous delivery and like modern architectures like the microservice architecture, for instance, allow teams to all work in what could be considered very small products that don't need a lot of integration with other teams. And so in that particular case, you might kind of, less might not be as advantageous.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for that thought. Okay, so next up we have Scrum at Scale. And this is a framework that is created by Jeff Sutherland and Scrum Inc. And so this is their version of scaling Scrum. And I'm just going to scale this window a bit so we can actually see the images that we're looking at. Similar to Scrum itself, they've created a guide for Scrum at Scale. And so you can find this at their website, scrumatscale.com. And you can look at kind of all this information and get into more of the details that we may not cover here as you look through that. Scrum at Scale is very much what they've described as a modular framework. And there's all of these different modules that you see represented here with these different boxes of things that are important. But what Scrum at Scale doesn't do is suggest how you should do them or in what order you should implement them. And so really it's saying these are all things that are valuable and important in scaling Scrum and really growing in that way. But as an organization, you need to figure out which ones to do first and in what order and what that actual implementation for you looks like. They also, it's probably in a different picture maybe further down, but they also kind of highlight at what level of the organization each of these things needs to happen at. And so some of them would be just team level, and some of them would be team, organization or department and enterprise, that type of thing. And so there's some guidance provided there in terms of what levels of the organization need these things. I think an interesting one in terms of how we would implement them, that particular module, which is left open, is this like metrics and transparency. So again, saying we have to have them. It's important to know how we're doing and being able to measure, but the metrics that are important to the organization, Scrum at Scale would say, well, you figure out how to do that. So you figure out what you're going to measure and how. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's an interesting example in terms of, it needs to be there, but you figure it out.
Yeah. And just a note on that modular approach. It's interesting to see just how different some of the organizations that have implemented this model actually are in mm-hmm. both in their values and in their cultures. But at the core of it all, they get a lot of the same kind of agile benefits from the values and the principles through this model.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Okay. Scrum at Scale also has 2 cycles on which these modules exist. One is the Scrum Master cycle, and really thinking about how to improve the team's process and the organization, and really looking at, moving faster and being better at what we're doing. And the product owner cycle, really looking at, the product, the vision, where we're headed, and making sure that we're building the right thing, and kind of maximizing towards the return on investment that we'd be looking for from the product.
Nice.
Most of these things I think are clear and understandable that we've seen before. We have release planning, we have backlog, refinement, prioritization, must have a strategic vision for the product, where are we headed. There's some team level processes that we get into. And then on the kind of Scrum Master side, continuous improvement, coordination across teams, and the deployment and some of that technical excellence as far as getting our product out. At the end of it all in these cycles, right, we have this potentially shippable increment, just like we would for Scrum. The thing that's a little different here that I wanted to call out was these executive Scrums. So we have an executive meta Scrum and executive action team. And those are really laid out as, Scrum at Scale really says that Scrum does scale, and it should scale all the way up the organization. And the method that they use for that is the Scrum of Scrums. And really, from the teams all the way up to the executives, every day there's a Scrum of Scrums, of Scrums, of Scrums, until we reach the top, and impediments are removed for the teams all the way, such that nothing is holding them back. And I'm just going to scroll down here so we can just get a look at what that might look like. So this is kind of the idea of the Scrum of Scrums, where each team has their own Scrum Master and their own Scrum, and then representatives from that team would go to the Scrum of Scrums. So you see the first picture here with 5 teams, what that would look like. When we get to 25 teams, now we're having what they call a Scrum of Scrums, where you have your teams and they all have their Scrum of Scrums, and then representatives from those Scrum of Scrums go to the Scrum of Scrums. And so that's the way that they've kind of scaled that communication, impediment removal, continuous improvement, those types of things across the organization.
Nice.
The other thing that's interesting there is how that relates to the executive action team. And so we see the same picture here, where that scales all the way up to the executives. The executive team would have representatives from these Scrum of Scrums, and they would have their own Scrum and figure out what's still left that needs to be resolved for the day. And then that's their actions. And they have, a Scrum board that they'd work off of to get that done and really focus on removing those impediments each day. Organizational impediments that teams could not do that got all the way up to the executive level. So
I've read that Scrum at Scale treats scaling as a fractal property, and you can really see it kind of play out in this diagram here.
Yeah, can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So a fractal property is just something that can be repeated ad infinitum, and you could see that. I'm not sure how many teams you've got in this particular diagram, but you could imagine that there would be you could imagine that there would be 5 of these beside each other, and they would each roll up again to another one higher level each. And you could do this with in exactly this pattern for as large of a company as you really wanted.
Yeah, nice. Okay. I appreciate the thought. That's really cool. So that's Scrum at Scale. We're going to move on to disciplined agile delivery. And Erkan's going to talk us through this a bit here.
Okay. So disciplined agile delivery, or DAD. Let's see. Okay. So we're talking about this in the context of scaling, although it's not specifically a scaling framework per se, or it wasn't created that way, even though some organizations choose to use it as a scaling framework. It's best described as context-specific adoption guidance that you can use while implementing any other framework. So for instance, if you're implementing SAFe, you might find yourself in a certain situation with a management team facing a certain issue, and you can come into the DAD framework and look at that particular situation, and then get a number of different options that you can that you might use to solve the problem or to move forward within your agile adoption. One of the interesting things I've heard DAD described as is, instead of failing fast, it gives teams this advice so that they don't fail at all in the first place. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about the learning model. And then it's very goal driven. So you kind of you drill into whatever piece of this that you're interested in, and you come in with a goal, and you input the specific context that you've got, and then you output choices for that context, and it just facilitates conversation. So potentially you might be stuck in figuring out how to move forward in your implementation. There's 4 life cycles. So there's the DAD life cycle at the bottom. That's the one that it kind of started with, and then it's evolved into more encapsulating models. So there's the disciplined DevOps, disciplined Agile IT, and then the disciplined Agile Enterprise. Okay, so if we look at the DAD model on the bottom, there is a suggested evolution of agile delivery teams. So the core of DAD is the cross-functional agile delivery team. And what they say is they expect you to start with the model on the left here, which is agile or Scrum, and evolve to the right. So evolve through different lean approaches, such as Kanban, and then into the more exploratory model. So that would be like the exploratory model of lean startup. And then the Scrum team would evolve into a continuous delivery model from lean and agile. And they're suggesting that this is kind of the pinnacle that teams want to get to. So one of the nice things here is, regardless of where you're at in your journey, the DAD model will kind of meet you where you're at and give you advice on how to get to the next level.
Interesting. Yeah. One thing I like here is that it's really agnostic as in terms of the framework, but really suggesting like, here's some frameworks or some stages of frameworks that you might want to, be involved in as you evolve, and really leaving it up to the organization to figure out which one that is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else here? Shall we move on?
I think that's good for this one.
Okay. So the next one we have is Nexus, which is the scaling framework brought forward by Scrum.org. And so again, similar to some of the other ones that we've seen, it's very much looks like Scrum in some ways. We'll go fairly quickly because I think it's reasonably well understood, this picture here, but same idea we've seen before is there's one product backlog. We spend time refining it. There's the sprint planning. Now a Nexus sprint planning. So kind of anywhere you see Nexus, it means like all of the teams. So the Nexus sprint planning has all of the Scrum teams doing their planning and coming up with a plan. Interesting thing here, where some of the other frameworks have a sprint backlog per team, Nexus advocates for one sprint backlog across all of the teams. And I believe the reason for this is for greater visibility in terms of dependencies and other things that might be going on kind of across teams. So one of the mechanisms that Nexus would use to help coordinate the work of all of the teams. Then you get into your sprint with advocates for 3 to 9 Scrum teams, and you're doing your standard sprint like we would in Scrum. However, there's this integration work happening here, and so making sure that everything is integrated all of the time. Some frameworks like LESS would say that this is the work of the team, and the teams figure out how to do this. Nexus calls out having a specific integration team to get the tools and practices in place that are necessary for this to work at such a scale. Then you drop out of your sprint with your usual sprint review, and up top here to your retrospective. So your Nexus retrospective with all of the teams. You come out of that with your product increment, of course, and they call out that it's integrated. So saying like it's all built together from all of the teams working on this. During the sprint, there's a Nexus daily scrum, which is like the scrum of scrums. It's representatives of all the teams. And then you have each team having their daily scrum. And then we repeat. Okay. And the last one we had here was around Spotify. And so a lot of us have seen the Spotify model. And Spotify, it's an interesting example where Spotify will be the first to suggest that this isn't a scaling model. It's not even what we do anymore. It's something that at the time was useful as an organization. And if you want to figure out what's useful for you as an organization, you need to kind of evolve and figure out what patterns and what things are helpful in your context.
And this is from 2012, just to build on that point. If they said it was out of date the moment they published it, it's been heavily talked about and emulated in Silicon Valley, but that was 6 years ago. Yeah,
and there's even articles I've seen on LinkedIn and whatnot of people saying like, don't copy the Spotify model, essentially because it won't work for you. Yeah. Which I think is a valid point, because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is context specific. And really, that's why maybe a scaling framework can't just apply and work everywhere. Mm-hmm. But there's some valuable things here that I think we can take away. And so what Spotify kind of did is they set up these tribes, and it's really kind of like a product group or maybe like a product area like you might see in the LESS framework. There's a Scrum Master, which I believe in Spotify they just called their coach or their agile coach. You have these squads. So each squad would be like a Scrum team, and they have their own product owner. Within those squads, there's chapters, and these are chapters. Chapters exist within a tribe, and they're all of the people related to a certain specialty. Okay, so your chapter might be like the testing chapter or the Java development or agile coaching chapter or things like that.
The other interesting thing about chapters is that the chapter lead is actually the line manager for his chapter members, and they have all the traditional responsibilities of managing people, like setting salaries and that kind of thing, with the caveat that they're also a member of one of these squads and delivery teams.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that's a good clarification there. And then the last kind of grouping that Spotify model has is the guild. And so this would be similar to like a community practice, in some other contexts, but really this can go across tribes. And what they're doing is bringing together anyone who's passionate or interested in a topic or furthering, a conversation or initiative or whatever, which is likely outside of the daily work of the team. As you see here, it can be from any of the roles, from any of the squads or chapters or tribes. And they would meet regularly to figure out like how to continue moving that thing forward. As it's not necessary, guilds would disappear and other guilds might emerge for, more pressing or more topics that are more, in need right now to be figured out. And so that's kind of what you'd see happen there.
The other interesting thing about this is that Spotify relies heavily on the continuous deployment model, and each squad can actually deploy to production independently whenever they want. So because of that, they're able to kind of decouple their teams and have them all act as like little mini startups. You could think of each squad as like their own little mini organization. And so it's very dependent on some of that more advanced technology being in place. And so if you try to mimic the model without some of that technological backing, then it becomes very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Okay. All right. So there you have it. That is kind of our overview on the different scaling frameworks. Bit of a discussion on when you might want to and might not want to scale Scrum or apply a scaling framework. And I think one of the most interesting points that Erkan mentioned there is Scrum scales itself, and don't try to scale your organization or your agile implementation until you're doing Scrum well. And once you have kind of that team level process going well, then you can start to see what that might look like as you scale outwards. It's Brock and Erkan signing off. Remember to stay tuned with the Superheroes Academy to unleash your agile superpowers.
Kapow!